Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Canadian Friends of Peace Now webinar. This is the fifth in our new series. My name is Joshua Cox. I'm a board member of the Canadian Friends of Peace Now, and I'm going to be your host this evening. Today, we are very pleased to have with us John Allan, a retired Canadian diplomat who served as ambassador to Israel. Our topic tonight is Israel's annexation plans and Canada's response. We're going to start with an overview presentation from Mr. Allan. He will discuss Canada's response to Israel's annexation plans thus far and how our government might respond if these plans go ahead. He will also give us a bit of a comparative analysis as to how Canada has responded to other similar breaches of international law and practice. After that, I will go to questions from the audience. So to all of you, to pose your question, please use the Q&A feature on the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of the screen. I invite everybody to write in your questions at any time during the webinar. So even starting now, or if John says something that interests you, please at that time take advantage of the Q&A function, ask your question. When we get to the Q&A section at the end, we're going to be asking all the questions. I'll call everybody out by name. Again, as I said earlier, please indicate the city that you're located in, and I'll also introduce you then. Please, also when you click on this icon, it's going to open up the side panel, and you'll be able to input the question very easily. So with all of that, thank you very much for allowing me to get through the general business. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce the chair of Canadian Friends of Peace Now, Gabriella Gallagher, to actually introduce our guest. Over to you, Gabriella.
Thank you very much, Josh. Before I introduce our guests, I'm going to say a very few words about Canadian Friends of Peace Now. We send funds to help the important work that Peace Now in Israel is doing. And we also are very active in Canada, especially now as the specter of annexation looms. We are a voluntary organization and we rely entirely on private donations. So if any of you wish to make a donation to us, we would be really grateful. Any amount is very welcome. And all you have to do is go to our website. That's at www.peacenowcanada.org. And any donation you make over $10 is eligible, will receive a tax receipt for tax deduction purposes. And now I will introduce our guests. I am very honored to introduce to you Mr. John Allan. Mr. Allan joined Canada's then Department of External Affairs in 1981. In addition to various postings abroad, he spent his early career in the Legal Bureau, where he represented Canada in disputes under the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. And he also worked in the areas of human rights and humanitarian and environmental law. And later, he held a number of senior positions in the department. He was also did this in Washington. And then from 2006 to 2010, he served as Canada's ambassador to Israel. And afterwards, he served as ambassador to Spain and Andorra. And he was later chargé d'affaires to the Holy See. Currently, he is a senior fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Thank you so much, John, for joining us tonight, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Gabriella. Thanks to you, Josh. Thanks to David Cohn, who engaged me initially on this, and thanks to Rachel Katz, who's behind the scenes making all this happen technically. As you know, in these Zoom days, nothing would happen if we didn't have somebody back there. we're all very lucky to be in Canada, where liberal democracy is still valued and defended. And I hope those of you who are in other places than Canada are as blessed as we are by a good government. In order to set the context for this conversation on Canada's options for responding to Israel's threatened annexation of parts of the West Bank, I wanted to briefly explore with you how our government and how Canadians more generally have responded to other recent examples of violations of international law, and how in each case the government has to balance its interests versus its values. It's important to talk about how Canadians respond, because you should realize that how they respond sometimes ends up affecting how the government responds. Sometimes they change their minds. Jake Sullivan, who was the former head of policy planning under Barack Obama, said that every US administration comes up short on the value versus interest question. Why? Because the charge of a president is to secure and safeguard the basic interests of the United States. And that requires engaging in geopolitics. And he continued, when you're engaging in geopolitics, you're inevitably pitting short-term security interests against long-term commitments to values. So that's what we're going to have a quick look at today in reference to some cases that Canadians and the governments faced. When we refer to values and interests, what are we talking about? On the values side, it's the rule of law, good governance, free and fair elections, and human rights, just for example. Canada's interests, on the other hand, include trade, political military alliances, protecting its citizens abroad, and in some cases, surprise, surprise, getting re-elected. It's also important to remember that Canada is a middle power with limited hard power influence and only a modicum of trade-related throw weight. As a result, we have to play our cards carefully and sometimes work with others when we're confronting bullies with whom we have important commercial or political relations. So now let's turn to some recent cases that required Canada to balance these forces and see if they give us some clues as to how the Canadian government might react if and when Bibi Netanyahu follows through on his annexation threats. First is the Khashoggi Case, which involved the brutal assassination in Istanbul by Saudi officials of a Washington Post journalist and Saudi national named Jamal Khashoggi. It was by any standard completely beyond the bounds of international law and morality. Not only did the murder take place without charge, trial, or conviction, it was carried out on another state's territory. It also followed a pattern of human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia and much criticism of the kingdom for its brutal tactics in the war in Yemen. After weeks of denial, the Saudi government admitted its officials had carried out the murder. Both the CIA and a UN special rapporteur concluded that Saudi Arabia's infamous crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, knew of and likely ordered the assassination. Given all of the above, it might have been relatively easy for Canada and the international community, for that matter, to condemn the Saudi government and the crown prince, demand a full accounting of those responsible, seek compensation, etc. The second case we're going to look at is the Meng Wanzhou case, the much in the news Chinese Huawei executive who was arrested by Canadian officials in Vancouver following a US extradition request. In response, without charge or access to proper consular assistance, China detained two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, and increased the sentences of two other Canadians from jail time to the death penalty. From Canada's perspective, these actions and the trade sanctions that followed were clear violations of international law and diplomatic practice. You'll remember perhaps that Michael Kovrig was and is a Canadian diplomat who was on leave. Our third case involves Russia's activities in Ukraine. Between February and March of 2014, you'll remember Russia invaded and annexed the Crimean Peninsula, an action that clearly contravened the UN Charter prohibition on violating the territorial integrity of another member state. So, how did Canada respond to each of these events? Canada condemned the Khashoggi murder and applied targeted sanctions against the Saudi officials accused of carrying out the murder. It did not criticize the Crown Prince, nor did it apply sanctions against him. For some time, it was, quote, considering, close quotes, whether to cancel a contract with Saudi Arabia for the sale of light armored vehicles worth almost $15 billion. But it never stopped delivering the vehicles, and in fact, it recently issued an export permit for them. When considering its responses, the government no doubt had in mind a previous incident when our foreign minister criticized the Saudis via Twitter for its abuse of women's rights, and the Saudi government responded by expelling our ambassador and recalling its own, suspending trade and investments, and forcing some 30,000 Saudi students studying in Canada to return home. By the way, some university presidents, usually strong supporters of human rights, weren't too happy with our foreign minister's tweet either, because they lost the income from all those foreign students. Now, in contrast, in the Meng case, the Canadian government has steadfastly stuck to its principles and proceeded with the possible extradition of the Huawei executive on the basis of its obligation to uphold the rule of law and its treaty obligations with the US. And it's done so despite significant pressure by China, by the families of the jailed Canadians, and by elements of the Canadian public. In response to Russia's actions in Crimea, Canada, led by its foreign minister, its ex-foreign minister, who was and is a Ukrainian Canadian with strong ties to that country, Canada condemned Russia's annexation as illegal. It joined with its G7 partners to expel Russia from the G8. It imposed sanctions on both the energy and financial sectors in Russia, as well as asset freezes and prohibitions on dealing with a variety of Russian individuals and companies. So that's what the government did. What about individual Canadians? Well, individual Canadians have been all over the map on these values versus interests issues. On Ukraine, of course, there was little pushback. Ukrainian Canadians are a substantial and organized voting bloc in Canada, not unlike the Jews. Second, our trade and economic interests with Russia are relatively small. And finally, Vladimir Putin is perceived as a ruthless bully by many Canadians, so punishing Russia and Russians had little political or electoral cost. The Khashoggi murder and Saudi's other human rights violations provoked vastly differing views from Canadians. A prominent Canadian academic argued that canceling the armored vehicle contract would have no impact on Saudi Arabia, but would affect some 3,000 jobs in Ontario. Others, interestingly, including union workers whose jobs would have been negatively affected if that contract were terminated, argued in favor of canceling it. For them, Canada's support for the protection of human rights was more important than the contract. In response to the Meng affair, one Canadian international lawyer argued that when Canada received the US extradition request, It should have warned Mrs. Meng not to enter the country. A former minister of Justice and former Supreme Court judge and 20 prominent Canadians in a letter released today argued that Canada should ignore our treaty obligations with the US and engage in a prisoner swap with the Chinese. Others, including myself, have suggested that kowtowing to the Chinese on this case will only encourage more of such renegade behavior in the future by China and by other bully states, including Iran and Russia. So what does all this mean for how Canada should respond to a decision by the Netanyahu government to annex parts of the West Bank? Let me begin by acknowledging that neither I, nor it seems even senior IDF generals and politicians in Israel, including the foreign minister and the defense minister, seem to have a clue about when Bibi Netanyahu may act and what type of annexation he might have in mind. The range of possibilities include no annexation and blame Benny Gantz and Gabi Ashkenazi for preventing it in order to call a quick election, annexing just the so-called major settlement blocks, including Ma'ale Adumim, Gush Etzion, and Ariel, all areas that Israel would likely retain in any negotiated peace deal with the Palestinians, or annexing the entire 30% of the West Bank, including the Jordan Valley, as set out in the Trump peace plan. Still, other options, as hinted last week by Benny Gantz, could include annexing areas that involve a maximum of territory, but a minimum number of Palestinians, so as to reduce any future demographic threat to Israel. What is clear, however, is that any unilateral annexation, including only a unilateral taking of the settlement blocks, would be contrary to international law, various United Nations Security Council resolutions, and a decision by the International Court of Justice. Our Prime Minister, as recently as 3 weeks ago, stated Canada's clear opposition to any unilateral annexation by Israel, and restated the government's strong support for a negotiated two-state solution. And he wasn't referring to a negotiation between Israel and the Trump administration when he was talking about a two-state solution and a negotiation. Before I share my views on what Canada might do in the face of an annexation, let's very briefly look at what some in Israel and elsewhere have said about the annexation. The commanders of Israel's security, a group of over 200 ex-IDF generals, heads of Mossad, and the Shin Bet, have said that any annexation similar to that proposed in the Trump plan would pose a serious threat to Israel's security. Security cooperation with Jordan and the Palestinian Authority, both of which have been key to preventing attacks on Israel, could be terminated. Indeed, the Palestinian Authority has already suspended their security cooperation. In addition, the PA could collapse, leaving the IDF fully responsible for protecting Israel from the entire West Bank and the Jordan Valley. Amos Gilad, one of Israel's most senior and respected former IDF officials, suggests that these new threats and responsibilities will force Israel to shift its focus away from its real enemy, Iran, and divert IDF resources from the Lebanese, Syrian, and southern borders. Moreover, he and others continue to ask, what for? Why would Israel unilaterally and without any pressing need incur enormous new costs, the animosity of the King of Jordan, the UAE, and other Gulf states with whom Israel has been improving its relations, the EU, the Democratic candidate for President of the United States and his party, and progressive Jews throughout the diaspora. Yossi Klein Halevi, who grew up on the far right and now describes himself as a centrist, has said that if annexation proceeds, it will be impossible for him to defend Israel on North American campuses and before progressive Jewish audiences, as he has been doing for a decade. And of course, many analysts have pointed to the existential threat that annexation poses to Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state. Any annexation that eliminates the option of a viable Palestinian state would, as we know, likely lead to a binational state with one of two outcomes. The Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem are granted Israeli citizenship and become a voting majority, the end of Israel as a Jewish state. Or the Palestinians are denied citizenship and Israel becomes an apartheid state. By the way, this is not a fantasy scenario. It has been warned against by such notable Israeli radicals as Ehud Olmert, Tzipi Livni, Ehud Barak, and many others. So how might Canada respond in the face of an annexation? On the values versus interests spectrum, Canada would, on the one hand, have to weigh respect for the rule of law, the UN Charter, United Nations Security Council resolutions, the Palestinian right of self-determination, and respect for the civil and human rights of the Palestinians more generally. On the interest side, there is the importance of Israel as a regional ally and the only true democracy in the region. Some bilateral security and intelligence cooperation, a relatively minor trade and economic relationship, and the importance domestically of the Jewish vote. The latter tends to be more organized and more focused than, for example, the Arab community vote in Canada. Yet another factor that Canada, and especially certain European countries, will have to deal with is the West's ongoing guilt for the Holocaust and the clear recognition of Israel as a safe haven for all Jews. From a practical perspective, Canada's response will also likely depend on how much territory is annexed and the extent to which it impacts on the viability of a Palestinian state and the possibility of a negotiated peace agreement. For example, annexing only the major settlement blocks might elicit a strong statement of protest and expression of concern about Israel's unilateral and illegal actions and the future of the two-state solution, but perhaps no more. Press releases would be issued and the Israeli ambassador could be called in. An annexation that hewed closer to the Trump's plan's maximalist approach could, especially if other like-minded countries agreed, lead to a significantly greater condemnation and explicit moves to punish Israel. These could include the temporary recalling of our ambassador, calling in her Israeli counterpart, the suspension of certain bilateral trade, economic, and research and development programs, and labeling or sanctioning any goods produced in the annexed territories. Canada could also support the PA in its efforts to protest, to prevent, or to reverse any annexations. For example, in the International Court of Justice or in the International Criminal Court. If the Palestinian Authority were to redeclare itself an independent state and define its own borders, would Canada join the 137 other states who have recognized Palestine as a state already? I'm not sure. Expelling Israel as a member of an international or regional organization would also be difficult, as frankly, Israel belongs to so few. That is something, however, that the PA likely would also push for. It's unlikely, in my view, that Canada or any other like-minded country would support a full BDS campaign. But as I said, some more limited sanctions could well be applied. In my view, in this case, Canada and the international community, unfortunately minus the US, should respond strongly and substantively if Israel moves ahead with any unilateral annexation. If we and others do not, it will be a clear signal to Israel that it is free to annex more territory and to ignore both international pressure and, perhaps more importantly, the rights of the Palestinians to self-determination. Failure to respond meaningfully will also send a signal to other states interested in violating international law and the territorial integrity of their neighbors. And they too will realize they can proceed with impunity. We should recall as well that once any annexation legislation is approved by Israel's Knesset, it would take a supermajority of 80 out of 121 MKs to vote it back, or a referendum to overturn such legislation. For Canada, and especially the Liberal Party, which has seen its support by the Jewish community wax and wane, depending on the party's statements and policies vis-a-vis Israel. For example, Jews flocked to the Conservative Party under the decidedly pro-Israel Harper government. Domestic politics will, of course, also play an important role. This is precisely why, in my view, progressive Jews and non-Jews in Canada who support a strong, secure, and democratic Israel, as well as the self-determination of the Palestinian people within a viable state of their own, we all should be unified and vocal in our opposition to any unilateral action on annexation before it happens. That means now. At the same time, we in the diaspora of all faiths and political stripes should be encouraging the Palestinians to put forward their own fleshed out plan for peace, one that clearly reaffirms Israel's right to exist in peace, one that signals a willingness to make compromises on key issues in exchange for those by Israel, and one that provides for a viable state with clear borders and fulfills Palestinians' desire for self-determination. Thanks, and I'm very happy to take your questions.
Well, thank you, John. I very much appreciate the thorough background on the topic, as well as the description of your personal experience with all of the past circumstances, as well as ongoing international disputes. I think it's going to present an excellent conversation tonight. We already have a ton of questions that have come in. With that, I want to remind the audience that right now and at any point going forward, please do take advantage of the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please do write your name in and where you're from, and I'll try to answer as many questions as I'll try to ask as many questions as possible. Sometimes I may combine some so that John has the opportunity to respond to as many as possible. So, Mr. Allan, there is a question I wouldn't mind just starting with here. There is certainly, obviously, with, there's a common joke that, with 4 Jews, 5 opinions, right? I mean, we're going to have a very diverse audience tonight and a lot of different kinds of questions and different kinds of opinions. And so why don't we start with one question? I do have a question from Joel Eisenberg from Toronto. And Joel's asked, isn't the West Bank what is known as Judea and Samaria which are Israeli territory from thousands of years ago. Joel, I certainly don't mean to put words into your mouth, but there's a segment of the population which is raising this question, which says this is not even annexation. This is Israeli territory, and they have the right over their sovereign area to do with what they wish. Joel, I don't know if that's what you were asking, but that's a question I wanted to ask. And then also, there's a question from Judy Meyer, just kind of following on top of this, is how does international law regarding occupation apply to a situation in which the status of a territory occupied was and is in dispute? So perhaps that presents an opportunity there's a couple questions in there with some layering, but John, if you wouldn't mind just trying to tackle that for us.
Sure. My wife was born in Poland, and there's a city in Poland called Lvov, which was sometimes called Lvov, which was sometimes called Lemberg. In fact, it changed nationality 7 times between the First and the Second World War. For Israelis, for settlers, and for anybody to suggest that what happened 3,000 years ago justifies what has been clearly declared to be illegal in international law, I simply don't accept. There are disputed territories all over the world. Wars have settled boundaries, and we can't go back 3,000 years. And frankly, we can't go back to 1948, because if we went back to 1948, Israel would have 56% of the land, and Palestinians would have 44%. If we went back to 1967, there would be a different breakdown. What we have to do is deal with the reality on the ground. But the reality on the ground says that those territories, the Israelis call them disputed, and most of the world calls it occupied. Whatever it is, it does not permit a unilateral annexation. The Israelis have always said they were prepared to negotiate with respect to that territory, and the world has waited for that negotiation and would like that negotiation to happen, as would the Palestinians. And I think that's how it has to be resolved, not by grabbing it and not by unilaterally annexing it. I don't know whether that answered Judy Meyer's question. This, as I just said, it's called disputed territory by the Israelis. It's called occupied territories by the United Nations and by the International Court. Whatever it is, it should not be unilaterally dealt with.
Excellent. Thank you, John. We have a question from one of our board members, David Cohen, and he was wondering if you had any experience with the topic of Morocco and Western Sahara. What kind of similarities do you see between Israel-Palestine and that situation? Could you comment on that? And what has been the attitude of Canada toward that dispute?
Well, Gabriella gave me a little heads up on this one, because I'm no expert on the Polisario Front dispute with the Moroccans. All I can say really on that is that this is a territory that is in dispute. It's subject to a number of United Nations Security Council resolutions. There is a peacekeeping force there, and there has been an agreement that a referendum would decide whether or not Morocco should take control of the entire territory, or the Polisario Front should be allowed to retain, through self-determination, a part of the Saharan desert for its own. I don't know what Canada's position was originally on this, but I do know that there's a peacekeeping force there, and we head it. So I can only assume that we're in solid support of the UN on this. that there is efforts right now to try and get that referendum up and running so that there can be a peaceful settlement of the dispute. So to the effect, to the extent that I see some comparison or some relevance to what's happening, I would simply suggest that the Israelis and the Palestinians get back to the negotiating table and work out the border and ensure each other's security and future peaceful relations.
Okay, thank you again, John. I have a question from Bruce Handel, and he asks, do you think that sufficient pressure can be applied to make the government of Israel not annex territories?
Oh, I think sufficient pressure can be applied. I think the sufficient pressure would come from the White House. It may have already come. There were meetings for the last 3 days in Washington between the American ambassador to Israel and some Israelis and the Trump administration in an effort to try and figure out just how Israel should proceed. Unfortunately, no conversations with the Palestinians about how they should proceed. So yes, pressure from the United States, pressure perhaps from the Saudis, if it was very clear that any further progress on diplomatic or trade or other relations could not proceed. We have heard from the UAE ambassador to Washington and minister in the UAE cabinet who wrote in Yediot Ahronot warning Israel that any annexation would put into question the diplomatic gains that Israel has made over the last few years, substantial diplomatic gains that go largely unreported. So I think, there is pressure that can be exerted. To be honest, Canada is not going to turn Israel's mind around, Bibi's mind around. And the EU by itself probably won't turn Israel's mind around, although it's Israel's largest trading partner. And whether or not they can get consensus, sanctions could well be imposed by the EU. So yes, pressure, yes, it's got to be from the right source.
Okay. I wouldn't mind asking, just pivoting here a little bit and asking some questions around the Canadian response. So I actually have a question here from one of our board members and our chairman, Gabriella Gallagher. And she wanted to ask about the, I'm so sorry, the pending the US reaction, is Canada kind of waiting on what that's going to look like to speak out more strongly in order to take a more firm opinion? What do you think about the Canadian reaction so far? And there's a couple other questions I have here from the audience I wouldn't mind just kind of baking into this. So different Jewish organizations throughout Canada have also put statements forward. You even have signed your name to certain, I think, 2 different statements at this point. What do you think of the reaction so far? Is it enough? The Canadian response as well, is it enough? What do you think?
Well, I'll start off by saying I don't think the Canadian reaction is really going to be determined by the US in this case. I don't, a lot of people think that Justin Trudeau's 20-second silence reflected the fact that we're afraid of the United States, et cetera, et cetera. On this issue, the like-minded Australia, New Zealand, the Europeans, ourselves, the Nordics, all support the 2-state solution, and we do not, I would suggest, support the Trump peace plan. So the pressure on Canada is not from the United States. Have we done enough? We have spoken out. we have made it clear, as I said, that we support the two-state solution and we oppose unilateral annexation. Could the Prime Minister have said more? Could the minister say more? Yes, I think so. The foreign minister, equivalent of the European Union, has spoken out. As I said, the King of Jordan, the UAE, others have spoken out, as has Joe Biden in the States and Nancy Pelosi, and 180 some odd Democratic members of the House signed a letter. So we could do more. I would note that the Prime Minister, when he made that statement, it was in response to a question from a journalist. It was not given unilaterally, so to speak. But that's the way they've chosen to play it, and we'll see what happens going forward. I should say, though, that the Prime Minister mentioned in his response that when he spoke with Bibi Netanyahu and Benny Gantz, he did make clear to them that Canada opposed a unilateral annexation. And I frankly think the Harper government would have opposed it as well. Whether they would have said it vocally is another question.
Thank you, John. I just want a quick follow-up on that. I have a question from Ken Victor. And what do you think are the main consequences of the Canadian government taking a strong stance on annexation? He asks, Ken asked, what is your sense of how the current Canadian government reads the political consequences of taking a strong stand? What's going to be the blowback? What's at stake for its own future regarding the issue?
Well, as I suggested in my initial remarks, I think, the Canadian government is weighing, these various interests and values in trying to make a decision. It clearly has a Jewish community ear. There is pressure from the Jewish community. I would say what's interesting about this controversy, as opposed to many others, is that a much larger proportion of the Jewish community in Toronto and across the country recognize the dangers of annexation and likely oppose unilateral annexation of this territory at this time. Whether they want to speak out about it is another thing. Certainly the progressives, the so-called progressives, want to speak out about it, and thanks to Canadians for Peace Now and JSpace and New Israel Fund Canada, who've all joined together, that voice has been heard. And I do encourage everybody out there to send some money to Canadians for Peace Now, because if you believe in these causes, the only way they can survive is if they receive our funding. So I think the government is balancing that. I hope the government is also balancing the views of the small Palestinian community here and the views of Arabs and Muslims here. And I only wish, frankly, that they could gather together and present a strong view, as strong a view as the Jewish community does from time to time. So the government is weighing those factors, and is probably watching to see what their like-minded countries are doing. And I am hopeful, I'm hopeful that no annexation takes place, but I'm hopeful if any annexation takes place, the government will speak out strongly.
Thanks, John. I would like to ask a question about the Palestinian opinion about the two-state solution. So I have a question here, and I apologize. I don't mean to mispronounce your last name, but I have a question from Robin Ben Mergi, who asks about the Palestinians recognizing Israel and being the ones to initiate a two-state solution. And then I actually have another question from Naomi Sharir. And the question is there a Palestinian version of Peace Now or something like that? If not, why not? What would be the impact of such an organization on the issue, the Israeli-Palestinian issue? What can Israel, the United States, Canada, Arab countries do to create such a movement?
Mhm. Well, my understanding is that for the first time, maybe ever, the Palestinians have put forward a draft plan and submitted it to the quartet. The quartet is a body formed of Russian, American, EU, and UN diplomats who have their headquarters in Jerusalem, and who have been working on the sidelines. They've been more and less effective depending on the time and the situation on the ground. But I understand that the Palestinians have submitted something. Of course, the criticism of the Palestinians has been for years that they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, that they have rejected, but they have not put forward their own plans. I don't accept that fully because, frankly, over the last 11 years, the Netanyahu government has shown no interest in a two-state solution. In fact, Bibi has said that a two-state solution will not be created under his watch. And the government has only harmed the possibility of a two-state solution by settlement expansion and various other measures. But that said, as I said in my remarks, I think it is up to the Palestinians now to say, we don't like the Trump plan. It essentially sides with the Israelis on every final status issue. We reject that. But this is what we do want. These are the borders that we want. This is what we're prepared to do on the right of return. This is what we're prepared to do on Jerusalem. This is what we're prepared to do to help secure Israel's security and our own, et cetera, et cetera. Why there isn't a peace now in the Palestinian territory? Well, you know, to be my own perspective on that is there's a fairly obvious asymmetry in the situation between Israel and the Palestinians. They see themselves, the old guard, as fighting, you know, for their existence. Perhaps the young guard is now fighting for the binational state, and maybe some may be giving up on the two-state solution. But we haven't seen a peace now. But on the question of recognition, the PA recognized the state of Israel during the Oslo process and has never withdrawn that recognition. Hamas is a different story, we know, but the people we're dealing with and the people that Israel should be negotiating with is the PA. And there's no question that Israel has been recognized by them.
Thanks, John. I have a question from Montreal, from Roberta Kapelovich. She says, bonjour and hello. And the question is, how are Netanyahu's legal issues going to intersect with the annexation issue?
Well, the annexation could come as early as July 1st. Doubtful. We really don't know when it will come. I mean, literally, senior IDF people have never been consulted on this. So this seems to be a conversation between the Americans and Bibi and his inner coterie, his ambassador in the US and his ambassador, the Israeli ambassador in the US and his ambassador in Israel. So we don't know what's going to happen. But I think I can safely say that Bibi's legal problems are not going to be finally dealt with for a long time. So there's a lot of damage that could be done by way of unilateral annexation long before Bibi, there's an initial decision, and long before there's appeals to that decision, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we should keep our eyes on the annexation ball and not hope that an Israeli court is going to somehow prevent this from going forward.
Okay. I have a question from Jacqueline Schwartz, who is also a member of the Peace Now board. And Jacqueline's question is, what about Jordan? How important is the Jordanian reaction to the prospect of annexation?
It's a great question. As Amos Gilad and others have said, the security relationship between Jordan and Israel, which is rarely talked about in the press, is vital for Israel. It's not the border between Jordan and Israel, it's the border between Iraq and Jordan that is protected by Jordan. Jordan is also majority Palestinian. And if Israel were to proceed with annexation, to take the Jordan Valley, the king has made clear that this is going to have serious implications for Israeli-Jordanian cooperation. And even if he didn't want to, there is the possibility that his street, that the majority Palestinian population will rise up if he doesn't break off cooperation or break off relations. Now, I know that there are some people that say Israel annexed the Golan Heights, nothing happened. The United States moved its embassy to Jerusalem, nothing happened. Israel can annex, nothing's going to happen. It's possible, but I think it's telling that hundreds of senior former generals and heads of intelligence and internal security agencies are warning that something may well happen. If a major annexation were to go ahead, it is really conceivable the PA would disappear. They would either unilaterally disband themselves, or they'd be forced to for basically ending the possibility of a two-state solution. Because if the Trump plan annexation went forward, there would not be a viable contiguous Palestinian state. Palestinians would literally have to go through Israel to get from one part of their so-called state to another. There would be no East Jerusalem as their capital, et cetera, et cetera. So there are very, very serious concerns that should be being taken into account right now. And they don't seem to be. At least there's a concern that they are not being taken into account. And nobody seems to know where Benny Gantz and Gabi Ashkenazi are on this, which is, needless to say, disturbing for those who thought that Blue and White was going to offer either a balance or a moderation or prevention of unilateral actions like these.
Thanks, John. I have another question from Izzy Lyon in Toronto. Izzy is also a member of our board, and he asked a question which I really wanted to ask myself, and I thank him very much, Izzy, for asking this question. But do you think there's any way that Bibi is doing a good bad cop routine here by threatening total annexation and then only doing partial annexation, expecting everyone to have a sense of relief after that was all avoided? My question was really that kind of same thing. Wait for the blowback, which is all happening now, and then go ahead and annex those sections which are heavily populated by Israeli settlers and not annex everything, and then just wait for the paltry response that comes from that.
Yeah.
Do you think that this has been the big plan all along, or is this not what you're thinking?
Well, I don't think it's, I really can't read Bibi's mind. I mean, on the one hand, as you know, he's got a certain group of settlers who are saying even the Trump plan is bad because the Trump plan envisages a Palestinian state as Bantustan-like as it is. Then there are settlers who say, let's grab what we can now, we'll worry about the two-state later, it'll never happen. And then, there are people, most Israelis, I think everybody has come to this consensus, certainly within Israel, that the major blocs are going to remain, and have been convinced that it's Israel's security dependent to keep those blocs. So, as I said, he could end up just doing that. He won't appease the settler blocs, because these are the settlements that have been around for a long time. They're not the outlying settlements. They're not the full 137 settlements that might be included. So there will be people on the right that will be unhappy. There will be people on the left that will be unhappy. But he well could do that. And you're right, and Izzy is right, that the blowback, and as I suggested, would not be nearly as severe. But as I also suggest, it's a dangerous road to hoe, because then, okay, I've now annexed. I haven't just occupied. I have annexed. We own it. We are now applying Israeli law. And when we want to annex another part, we may just go ahead and do that, because it's much easier to fend off sanctions if you do it bit by bit.
Right. Okay. I want to return to a question here that I've had waiting for a little while, and just want to say, Allan, thank you for your patience, because I know you asked this question early on. Alan Fox from Toronto asks, what will it take to see Israeli voters stop supporting the fascist parties? Is that possible? I mean, we can say the parties that are currently being supported in Israel by the voters, if something happens internationally and the situation actually changes for Israel getting isolated, is there anything that would actually impact the way that Israeli voters vote?
I'm not sure. Because you could get in the tent, protect yourself mentality. The Europeans are against us. If we lose Trump, the Democrats are against us. The diaspora, naive Jews or progressive Jews are against us. So you could get a bad reaction to it. It's always disturbed me that Bibi has been able, through fear, whether it's the fear of Iran or the fear of Hezbollah or the fear of Hamas, through fear, to convince Israelis that he is the only one that can save the country. They've had lots of other leaders who have done well, and there are certainly others who could lead the country and would do so in a manner that wouldn't be attacking the rule of law, the justice system, breeding polarization, breeding hatred for Palestinian Israelis. I don't understand. I don't think he's a fascist, but I think he's right now out to preserve some kind of legacy for himself and stay out of jail. But I don't know what would fundamentally change the mind of Israelis, because the real fear, as I hinted at, is that if there is an election now, that Bibi will get a significant majority, even though he hasn't done such a great job, it turns out, on coronavirus. And even though he may be putting Israel into very dangerous position via this annexation, Israelis are not paying attention to this. We are going crazy in the diaspora, and the UAE and the Jordanians and everybody else is concerned. And when you ask Israelis, I think there were two polls, 42% opposed annexation, 36 supported it. And of the 36% that supported it, it was like number 4 on their priority list after the economy, COVID, something else. You know, annexation's not even on their radar screen. So I don't know what they're reading. They're obviously not reading the Times of Israel and Haaretz, but, or maybe they're not reading. I don't know. If there is some Israelis listening in, please tell us, because I'm not sure.
Okay. So John and everybody else, we're getting up to the top of our entire hour here. So I just have a couple other questions I'd like to ask before we wrap up today. I also just want to say in advance to everybody, I already know that we're not going to make it to every single one of the questions. The questions have been excellent, generally very cordial. And I just want to say thank you very much for keeping this to be an excellent conversation. So I have 2 questions. I kind of just want to keep it topical again. 2 questions regarding COVID-19. One question from Rabbi Shalom Schachter in Toronto. And the question is, if annexation happens and we start to see a intifada happen as a result of it, how do we combine that with the ongoing coronavirus pandemic? And is anybody talking about that as a increased added element of risk?
I'm sure that there are people in the IDF and in the Shin Bet and in the Mossad that are talking about it and that are concerned about it. I think it may already be a concern because Palestinian cooperation is no longer. And I know the numbers of cases have increased rather significantly, more in Israel than in the West Bank, but also in the West Bank. We're now in the hundreds of cases in the West Bank. And of course, Gaza is the real concern. I haven't seen too much analysis that combines these 2 sets of issues, but it certainly should be one of concern. And as suggested, if annexation takes place and the PA collapses and Israel becomes responsible for areas A, B, and C in the Jordan Valley and has to put soldiers in there and has to deal with medical issues like COVID and others, they are going to be responsible for all that territory. That is, according to the commanders for Israel's security, billions and billions of shekels. I don't know. Those are the reasons that Amos Gilad says, why is this being contemplated?
Mm-hmm. So John, there's another COVID-19 question I just want to squeeze in. And that is the kind of very topical announcement that Israel and the UAE are going to be participating in a COVID-19 response. Given that timing, and by the way, I'm sorry, this is a question from Howard Danziger. Given that timing, does this signal anything larger in the sense that Gulf states may not be interested in punishing Israel if they go ahead with some sort of annexation? Are you reading anything into this?
No. I mean, I don't know if you've been following this, but there was a shipment of ventilators that arrived, and because the Israelis had not dealt with the Palestinians whatsoever, it was just UAE, Israel, and then it was going to be allegedly or accusations. This is a Hasbara moment. This is a moment for Israel to demonstrate that they care. The Palestinians rejected the receipt of those ventilators. I happen to be on the board of a nonprofit called Project Rosanna, and we procured 20 ventilators and worked with the Palestinians and had those 20 ventilators delivered via the WHO, and they were welcomed with open arms by the foreign minister. I would tend to go with the words of the UAE ambassador in Washington, who said, and has repeated on an Israel policy forum, Zoom that this is very dangerous territory for the Israelis to be entering into. And all of those diplomatic advances that they have made, and they are significant, and Israelis are very happy about them, could be in jeopardy. We will see, as your questioner and as you suggest, we will see.
Okay. So I think it's about time that we're going to have to wrap this up. And so I'm going to try to end tonight's webinar with something hopeful. Hopefully, we always try to do this. Again, we don't try to be naive, but hopefully we can try to be hopeful. And so I'm gonna ask just a question here from Aidan Robertson, and I'm gonna combine it with some elements from Smadar Myri and various others who have asked these kinds of questions just regarding what we can still do, right? So Aidan's question is, what do you think is the best way for the government of Canada to deter Israel from annexation? Or let's say to actually deter Israel from annexation now? Obviously, there's a large number of people who are on this webinar tonight who are listening as audience members. Many of us are board members from a variety of different organizations, many of which are Jewish. And we would like to make our voices heard. What can the government do? What can we do with the last couple days here before annexation potentially gets announced?
Well, I'll say generally, I think it is extremely important that progressive groups have come together already, and that they have made their views known, and that they have made it clear to the Canadian government that there is not one voice that speaks for the Jewish community. I think it would be great if our Arab and Muslim friends could join with us, and we could work with them to send a similar message. Okay, not only letters jointly from Canadians for Peace Now, NIFC, and JSpace, but join together with some mosques, some organizations, and make a plea to the Canadian government that there is a substantial number of Canadians who want to see a two-state solution, who want to see a secure and safe Israel, and want to see self-determination for the Palestinians. It may be a little late, but frankly, I don't think annexation is happening on July 1st. I would be amazed if it did. So if to the extent that you have those connections and you can make them, I think that would be equally strong. But I do think it is important now that the government begins to understand there's a broad community out here. And unfortunately for Israel, fortunately for us, it's brought that community together and it's made it vocal. And out of bad things come good things. Lots of good things have come out of COVID, strangely. So the voice is hopefully being heard, and the pressure on the government will be balanced going forward.
Okay. So with that, I'll just say thank you very much, Mr. Allan. Tonight's conversation has been really wonderful for me, and I know I speak for the audience here. And I think it's been great for everybody too. I mean, there's been a ton of feedback, different questions or comments coming in about you. Really appreciating all of your insights tonight. I also want to thank all of the audience members who showed up to listen, and all of the audience members who provided questions in advance, as well as during the session tonight. We've had a really good discussion. We've covered a ton of ground, and I can't thank all of you enough for participating in this big mutual discussion about this really important topic. So thank you, Gabriella, for your introduction, and thank you for all the other organizations who were part of this tonight. So I just say with that, have a good evening, and we will all continue this work. The work doesn't stop tonight. As per John, there's a ton of work that we can continue doing, whether it's donating with our dollars, whether it's writing letters, generally get together and talk about this topic with your friends and family. So with that, I'll just say good night and thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing all of you again in the future. Take care.
Thank you all.